Forgive me if it's a little long. I was asked to do the context for Lafayette's speech. So you won't get much in this on Lafayette's personality, his history in France, his history in the war. Much of that actually is available on the website of the Historical Society from a previous talk given by one of the chief spokesmen for the American Friends of Lafayette, Dr. Patty McClay, who goes around everywhere talking about his promotion of civil rights, rights of women, and other events. So if you want more on Lafayette per se, I recommend that. But I'm looking at his historical impact. If you look at all the advertisement, you'll see that there are about 3 variations of the title of this speech, because I kept groping for the right way to reflect that. But I leave it to you to decide. So when Lafayette arrived in the United States in August 2024, he was thrust into the middle of an election campaign. This actually is very appropriate for last fall, right? That many feared could tear the nation apart. 4 candidates, all professing allegiance to Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party, were locked in a vicious campaign for the presidency. Most worrying was the fact that these candidates each was primarily based on a different section of the country. Quincy Adams in the Northeast, William Crawford on the Deep South, and Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson from the Western states. Now, underneath these sectional divide, however, there were policy issues, significant ones, that would determine the fate of the United States for years to come. And at the top of that list was the American system of economics, which you have literature on right here. A set of Hamiltonian principles for nation building, which were being loudly championed by Henry Clay in the Congress and vigorously supported by John Quincy Adams, who was Secretary of State. Crawford, who had been officially nominated by a caucus grouping in Congress and was supported by New York fixer Martin Van Buren, was unequivocally opposed to this program, while Jackson downplayed the policy altogether, preferring to rely on his reputation as a military leader. What was this American system that caused such a strong divide? Well, Abraham Lincoln summarized it as a 3-part program: national banking, protected tariffs, and federal support for internal improvements, what we call infrastructure. States' rights and slavery advocates hated this platform, instead championing so-called free trade and reliance on state or private financial institutions. Intentionally or not, their outlook put them on the side of the British Empire, which sought to remain the workshop of the world, confining other nations to be suppliers of their raw materials and using its trade policy to prevent the rise of a rival to their manufacturing status. For this reason, Henry Clay, for example, denounced the free trade system as simple subservience to British colonialism. Incumbent President James Monroe had issued an invitation to his friend Lafayette to visit the United States in February of 1824. This was also officially done by Congress. And he tried to remain neutral. I mean, publicly he was neutral, because contenders had 3 members of his cabinet, right? John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State, William Crawford, Secretary of the Treasury, and I believe that, well, actually, Calhoun briefly was in there, and he was also in the government. But over the course of his administration, from 1821 to 25, Monroe had gradually moved away from the Jeffersonian hardline against federal support for becoming more industrialized toward adopting American system policies. And this had alarmed the Crawford wing of the party. Now, did Monroe believe that Lafayette's visit would help strengthen his side of the party and even strengthen the motion toward industrialization? Perhaps. We'll evaluate that. What is undoubtedly the case is that Lafayette's 13-month-long tour as guest in the nation turned the nation's attention toward the accomplishments of the revolution, for which he had sacrificed his fortune and risked his life. His secretary, Auguste Lavasseur, forgive me the French, who accompanied the general and wrote a detailed memoir of the tour, reported that the joyous reception of Lafayette actually wiped out the acrimonious coverage of the presidential campaign for at least a couple months in the fall of 1824. And you know, it was everywhere, the turnout. This is a picture of, or an image of the turnout in Philadelphia, right, for Lafayette. In the rest of this presentation, I will elaborate more on the political stakes in the election, the promise of the American system, and the intimations we have of Lafayette's role in helping the nation weather that political crisis. So Lafayette, it would be hard to exaggerate the esteem that Lafayette was held in the United States. This is a picture actually from that trip. I mean, he was painted, you know, many, many times, or statued and so forth. So even 40 years later, you know, he was epic, right? He put his life on the line, he'd spend his own money, unlike all the other guys, many of the other guys from France who came over and said, here I am, pay me to help you out. He asked for nothing in compensation, and he realized that the young republic was bankrupt. He outfitted his own ship to come here, the Victoire, and he did it against the explicit order from the king, who said, don't go. The king was not particularly inclined to the American War of Independence at this time. So Americans were really grateful toward Lafayette and it stirred up their patriotic fervor. Of course, many of his close friends were already deceased. His adopted father, George Washington, his collaborator, Ben Franklin, his bosom pal, Alexander Hamilton, were dead. But he had retained friendships with many other Americans he had met in Europe, some of whom had helped him and his family escape death. This included Monroe, John Quincy Adams, David Money, I understand now, and Thomas Jefferson. But, you know, Lafayette, like Monroe, tried to remain neutral, you know, between these guys. Yet evidence that I've recently come across highlights the critical role Lafayette played in supporting the American system of economics, starting as early as 1784. And his actions underscore his positive contribution to the success of the American Republic long after the Revolutionary War was ending. And this is just an image of the celebration of the American system and the economic progress we made in our first 100 years of existence at the Philadelphia Centennial. So just to understand what was going on at that time, you've got to understand a bit more about the history of the American system fighting. So the program is basically laid out in Hamilton's Report on Manufactures, 1791. Again, the book Hamilton versus Wall Street is extremely useful in getting that. And that paper outlines how to develop a manufacturing base and no longer be an economic colony of Great Britain. Requires federal credit, requires federal support, requires infrastructure supported by the federal government. He created that sovereign credit system of the National Bank. He called for certain kind of protection, support for national infrastructure, actually a national transportation system, and a liberal, and that's his word, approach to national funding for initiatives serving the, quote, general welfare. I learned a fantastically upsetting idea yesterday when I was talking to people at this book fair, because I was asking them to recite the preamble, right? And the preamble includes promote the general welfare. And one of the women who I spoke with said, I get a blowback from students on the promote the general welfare. They don't want to include that because they don't want people on welfare, do you? Right? So their understanding, I told her, gee whiz, you know, and that's the one aim of our government, which is actually in there twice. It's not only in there in the preamble, it's also in Article 1, Section 8 for the Congress, its responsibility. So, you know, we've gone far away from the concepts that were there, and many people objected to it then, not with the image of welfare the way we have it, but for their own reasons. So Hamilton did a virtual financial revolution to try to establish his system. That also put the nation on the road toward abolishing slavery if it had been successful. It was a moral abomination. He thought so. He was a leading member of the New York Manumission Society. And that's another area where he was linked to Lafayette, who was extremely anti-slavery and who was elected an honorary member of the New York Manumission Society in 1788. So Hamilton believed that chattel slavery was not only a moral abomination, but an economic disaster. The prerequisites for progress meant technological progress, providing those infrastructure. They were just maintaining a standard of living where people could learn, you know, education ultimately. These policies were the very antithesis of those practiced and fought for by the slaveocracy. And what am I missing here? I've forgotten all my slides. Here you go. So there you got my friend Hamilton. This is his manufacturing pilot project. This is, I often ask people what this is. This is Passaic Falls, New Jersey, where he set up which was the most powerful water source in the country at the time, Niagara still being occupied by the British in 1791 when this was established. It was a step toward eliminating slavery. This is the Manumission Society, and Lafayette's membership. And this is an image, which is actually very interesting. The founder of Central Park, whose name? Olmsted. Did a tour of the South in the 1850s to take pictures, interview people. And these were published, showing that just on the face of it, you know, the physical conditions of so-called prosperity, the South, were abominable. But this was known as early as the late 18th century, if not earlier in that century. And it was a real life experiment to show that slavery was not only morally horrible, but also economically horrible. So now admittedly, Hamilton's progress on the American system was limited. He was, attacked throughout, but the ideas did catch fire with a section of his party, the Federalist Party. And Federalists are not exactly the same as Hamilton. There are Federalists who didn't even want manufacturing, they just wanted to keep shipping. In fact, the country was threatened with potentially being torn apart much earlier than we're talking about right now. But there was also a faction of the Democratic Republicans that was aware that Hamilton was right. If we were going to have real independence, we were going to have to get our own manufacturing base. And that was led by Matthew Carey. And if you don't know anything about Matthew Carey, as I have to tell you, a lot of members of the US Treasury did not, before I gave them a talk, then you don't really have a complete picture of how our country was developing, because he was the key transmission belt for Hamiltonian economics into the next generation, into the Lincoln administration, and so forth. So, Matthew Carey, let's give him a quick view. Now, Matthew Carey was a troublemaker from day one over there in Ireland, and he was fighting against discrimination against Catholics and British economic oppression. In 1779, as early as that, he was forced to flee to France to avoid arrest. And who did he meet? He met Ben Franklin. And he started helping with the printing operations and the work for the Revolution as early as that. And he also met Lafayette, who at that point was working with Franklin as well in the after he came back from the war. And he wanted to ask Lafayette if he could get the French to invade Ireland. No, they didn't go for it. But so he returned to Ireland and continued to fight for manufacturing in Ireland, because they had the same fight, as we had here. We were totally dependent upon the British. So, and he called it complete the emancipation of our country from domestic and external slavery. But in 1784, he was forced to flee to escape arrest for high treason. And he fled to the United States in disguise. Interestingly enough, 1784 was when Lafayette came back to the United States to have a reunion of sorts with the people he had been involved in the Revolution with. And he met Lafayette. And what did Lafayette do? Well, this guy was down and out. Lafayette lent him $400 to start a printing operation. And that printing operation was key to starting his whole career in promoting the American system for the next, until 1839, which is when he died. So Carey published leading documents. The American Museum only existed, that was his magazine. This is a magazine. We would think of it more like an encyclopedia or something. But very few years, 6 years, 7 years, but they published, it was during that critical period of the formation of the government, 1787 to 1792 or something in that period. So he published the Constitution. He published his final edition, published Hamilton's Report on Manufactures. Very valuable documents. And for that, we have Marquis de Lafayette to thank, because he wouldn't have been able to do it without. But he was only getting started. He turned to book publication, built a second career. This put him in odds with this party, with Jefferson for sure. But he continued to fight for continuing the national bank, and telling the Jeffersonians that, who were headed for war with England, that they were going to be destroyed. We were going to be destroyed if we had no source of funding. We're going to rely on the private banks, to fund us in the war and not have our own national bank. But they went ahead anyway. And after that, after the disaster of the war, and it was very much disaster, close to a disaster, he said, "Okay, I told you so." And he wrote a pamphlet, 300-page pamphlet. The people had attention spans back then, called The Olive Branch. And I think it was anything but an olive branch. But anyway, what that means is he attacked both parties for their errors in leading to the near disaster of the War of 1812. He attacked particularly the Federalist faction, which was pro-British throughout. But he also attacked the Democratic Republicans for having eliminated the bank and for having stripped our defenses, not having a navy, not doing the kinds of investments that were necessary strictly for defense. So the pamphlet kept selling out. He kept rewriting it, and it became more and more positive, actually. Every time he rewrote it, he put in more proposals for what should be done, and it became more and more of a Hamiltonian proposal for what should be done. So let's see, and included large sections of the Report on Manufactures. This is the pamphlet. You can see this is the title. It's hardly what you'd call yellow journalism. It's quoting Washington, he's quoting Ben Franklin, he's quoting Hamilton, and then he's writing for magazines, the Industrialist magazine, for agriculturists, for railroad interests, and so forth. And this is just, if you can read that, you can see the kind of things he's saying about what his idea of economics is, which is totally different from the way we talk about it today, I believe. So industry is critical, right? Government has to protect it. Political economy is what we need. So this caught on, and along with Henry Clay and John Marshall, close friend of Alexander Hamilton also, whose ruling on the Supreme Court confirmed the constitutionality of the national bank, we ended up getting a second national bank that functioned to do this. It began to participate in supporting infrastructure projects and in expanding industries that were technologically advanced. So again, this is 1824 approximately. And here we again have Lafayette coming on the scene. Because in 1824, in addition to Lafayette coming to the United States, Another refugee from Europe comes to the United States. His name is Friedrich List. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. If you read the Hamilton book, you have. He was a national economist in Germany, and he too was constantly getting in trouble with the government because he promoted the kind of manufacturing policies that the prince at that time didn't like. So he had actually had to flee to France in 1822, where he met Lafayette. And Lafayette at that point said, well, if you want to be safe, go to America, right? And he said, no, I'm going back to my country, I'm going to fight, and so forth. So he did go back, and he was in so much trouble that he finally decided that he better go to America. So he arrives in America at the same time Lafayette is arriving in America for this tour. And Lafayette meets him again and gives him his introductions to Carey and all the people in Pennsylvania in particular who are involved in the promotion of Hamiltonian economics. And he stays here for about 6 years, a little more, and becomes a major propagandist for the American system against slavery and so forth. So, do I have a slide? Yes. Well, this is Monroe's infrastructure. This is Professor. It looks very professorial, doesn't it? List. List actually internationally has been, prior to our work anyway, more well known than Hamilton. I mean, he was, the Germans, I guess, spread his work very broadly. But he's a Hamiltonian, there's no question about it. Okay, now, with all this activity, with, Monroe beginning to shift, with the Supreme Court, and so with the Second Bank of the United States doing the funding, I mean, we're back to where I said, things were going toward the American system in the early, around 1824. But there were other things going on, right? Recall that we just had the Missouri Compromise in the early 1820s. And that was that was a seismic event, much more seismic than I realized before I looked into it. It began in 1818, when Missouri wanted to come in as a slave state. Then in 1819, this New York legislator, James Talmadge, introduced amendments saying, well, you can get in as a slave state, well, actually, no, you can get in as a state, but no more slaves should be allowed in the state, and there should be a gradual plan for emancipation of all the slaves. So, all hell broke loose in terms of fights about this. Substantial excerpts of Talmadge's speech, which was published all over the country, are in this Defeating Slavery book, which I mentioned. So there were threats of civil war at that time, and the Talmadge's speech was, the circulation was banned. Here's Mr. Talmadge, distinguished looking fellow. This is the result of the Missouri Compromise when it actually passed, which you know what it is. This is a point where Calhoun is beginning to shift to a pro-secession view. He says, if you pass the Talmadge Amendment, he tells John Quincy Adams, you pass it, and we're going to have to ally with the British. Of Quincy Adams said, "What?" He said, "Yep, that's what we're going to have to do." So we get to the election. You were wondering if we'd ever get to the election, but there we are. So four guys. Andrew Jackson is the first to put his hat into the ring thanks to the Tennessee state legislature. This is hilarious. I mean, I forget what book it was that I was reading, but it's an apology for Andrew Jackson. Oh, he wasn't interested in the presidency at all. You know, he was really just sitting back and watching things go. He was the first. And he, you know, sought to have this populist attitude, which is not really accurate either. William Crawford, Treasury Secretary, the official nominee of the caucus. The unfortunate thing for him is he had had a stroke, and he could hardly go out in public. So, you know, that was sort of a loser. But he had the support of Martin Van Buren in New York, which represented New York financial interests, and was therefore meant he was something to be reckoned with. Now, following those, you had the nomination of favorite sons, basically. John Quincy Adams from Massachusetts, and Henry Clay from Kentucky. So then, for the most part, these guys didn't campaign. It was just a vicious press war, right? Jackson did campaign, but, you know. Pro-Jackson papers played up his military accomplishments. He was considered the representative of the common man, even though he opposed debt relief in Tennessee. The pro-Clay and pro-Adams papers blasted him as a militarist, including Jefferson in private. Jefferson did a lot of things in private. He actually, you know, he was a pragmatist, so he wanted to get the votes, for example, of Pennsylvania. Sound familiar? So he voted for a tariff, which he really was not so interested in, but he thought that was necessary to get the votes in Pennsylvania. So the campaign for Crawford was, he's the old Republican Party, but he was unabashedly anti-American system. And Henry Clay was vying for support of the Western states, best known for being a war hawk for the war, demanding the American system. So Adams tried to stay above the fray, you know, aloof, independent, but he and Clay, while they had very similar policies, didn't get along at all. They apparently clashed in Europe during the Treaty of Ghent negotiations. And the Southerners, you know, knew that Adams was anti-slavery, so they didn't like him at all. Now, the voting for president was very different from today. It wasn't all on the same day. It was over a period of time in the fall. The 6 states still chose their electors through their legislatures. Others had popular votes with increasingly less property qualifications. And when the tally was reckoned, the results were inconclusive. Jackson 99, Adams 84, Crawford 41, and Clay 37. Let me see if these are the results, which I guess you can see fairly clearly. No? Well, you can't read that kind of stuff. But, you know, these were, the margin was, there's closer, there are all sorts of things that have skewed this. Not the least, of course, is the 3/5 rule, which if the 3/5 rule hadn't been in effect, Adams would have won the electoral vote. But there were also others, places where people voted for the Federalist Party, right, which technically didn't exist. So clearly that was a vote for Adams. But, according to one extensive analysis I read, the popular vote margin was actually smaller between Adams and John Quincy Adams. But clearly the nation was split. It went into the House of Representatives. Only the top 3, that was a surprise to me, go into the state of representatives, and you needed 13 states. So the vote, so this is happening in December, right, which is when the Electoral College meets. The vote is early in February. So what's going to happen for those 2 months? Well, there's going to be a lot of activity for pressure, deals, and maneuvering. It was, the question is, where would Crawford and Clay go? Now, Van Buren tells Crawford, hold on to your votes. I think some of us may remember way back when conventions were a little bit more rough and tumble in the parties. People waited until the top guys knocked each other out, and then the third guy comes forward and takes the reign. So that he sort of was thinking like that. So he holds on to his 41 votes, which is Virginia, Delaware, and Georgia. So the question is Clay. What is Clay going to do? And as is well known, he uses his support for Adams, and everyone says corrupt bargain, and so forth and so on. I find it hard to say corrupt bargain. Obviously, you have to put your vote somewhere. And why not put it with the guy whose program is almost the same as yours? So anyway, Clay uses his influence not only in his states, but also in Louisiana, Illinois, and Maryland, who had not voted for him. But that wasn't enough. New York was still up for grabs, and New York was split, and they needed one vote had to shift to one guy or the other. So that one guy was Stephen Rensselaer III. Anybody ever heard of Stephen Rensselaer? You've heard of RPI. He founded RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. He was an aging brother-in-law of Alexander Hamilton. He was very rich. He was a supporter of the Erie Canal, and extremely religious. So the story comes down. Well, one story is he was always committed. New York was 50-50 between, it was 50-50. But Adams did very well in New York. I mean, it's not like this. So he was always, some stories say he was always committed to Adams, but he waited till the last minute, right? But the other story is that he saw a discarded Adams ballot on the floor at the last minute and saw this as a sign from God that he should vote for Adams and cast the deciding vote. So you can take your story, whichever. So Adams went on, so Adams won. And he initiated a huge wave of transportation, funding of transportation infrastructure, protective tariffs, advancing the cause of science, deploying the Attorney General on the side of the enslaved. But most historians have considered his presidency a failure. well, number one, he was one term. Number two, he was unable to unify the nation in order to appreciate what he had done. Now, the question that we come back to is, what was Lafayette's role in all this? From my review of Lavasseurs' record, and I highly recommended reading his whole travelogue. It's really fascinating to see what a Frenchman observes about the United States in 1824. The character, people, what happens with when Lafayette comes to town, you know, the fact that, you know, people come in with silk shirts and, you know, muddy boots, you know, not the same people. And, you know, how different it was from France. He's writing for the French to say, look, this is what happens when you have a republic, right? And we should do the same. That's the purpose of his doing this, is not to write it for us, but to write it for the French. So, because that was one of Lafayette's purposes, was to try to influence what was going on in France, which had moved back to more of an absolutist monarchy. So it's clear that the general spent more time with Adams than any other candidate. And that was obviously a benefit because he was covered in the media and Lafayette was extremely popular. He gave speeches in his honor. Lafayette invited him to travel with him. In the story, he goes down in October, and this is in the fall period, high election period. This is in October, November, September, October, November of 1824. So Lafayette invites Adams to travel with him down the East Coast to Fort McHenry, Baltimore. And what impressed him was that Adams said, they were on a ship, right? What impressed him is that Adams decides to sleep on the ship's deck with the crew, while Lafayette and Levasseur and his aides are in a cabin. So one of the guys goes out and sees the Secretary of State lying on the deck with these lowly people and says, you know, you've got to come in, you've got to come in. Adams said, no, you keep it, there's no room, blah, blah, blah. Eventually they put another cot in there and move him in. But they were very impressed with the egalitarian spirit in the United States at that time. Okay. Now, I don't want to say a lot about this, but the one other aspect of Lafayette's trip was not his outspoken attacks on slavery, because he thought that would be undiplomatic. But what he did do was he went out of his way to greet slaves, or former slaves, or slaves who had worked with him in the Revolutionary War. And the key one was this guy, James Armistead Lafayette, who, when he was visiting Richmond in the fall of 1824, showed up to see him, and he jumped out of his carriage and embraced him and put him in his carriage. And so, you know, this is not what you do in Virginia, you know, to win votes and influence people. But and he did, you know, things in other places. This guy had been a double agent for Lafayette during the Yorktown campaign. And Lafayette had personally intervened to make sure he got his freedom. So, but then, you know, following in this period, after this, after the election, Lafayette is planted in, it's not good traveling weather. So Lafayette is planted in DC in that crucial December to February period where everybody's horse trading, you know, and negotiating for what's going to happen in the new administration. He addresses Congress in on December 10th. There are numerous dinners, we know, with Lafayette, not necessarily tete-a-tete. So he has the press coverage. Of course, he's mostly in this northeast corridor, which is where Adams was strongest anyway. But when you look at the results, he didn't shift Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania goes for Jackson. He may have aided Adams in Maryland, which was 50-50. And he may have aided him in New York. We know that the general also had cordial relations with Andrew Jackson. There's a very interesting story about that. This story is from the Fredericktown Herald on February 19th, 1825. So that's after the vote. So take a look. You can see, use your little laser pointer. This is Lafayette. So this is what this article says. Very interesting. The reporter is interviewing Crawford, not Lafayette. Crawford had just been speaking with Lafayette. So Crawford says, Lafayette said that had Jackson been chosen, Washington Irving, who was a good friend of Crawford, would never have forgiven Lafayette, but it would have attributed his election, Jackson's election, to Lafayette, because he had two military guys, you know, military guy helping the military guy. In order to avoid any such influence, Crawford says, Lafayette said to him, and to show that I respected the civil more than the military power, I invariably avoided wearing my uniform, and on every occasion since I've been here, have reviewed the troops in my plain blue coat and road hat. Mr. Crawford expressed appreciation of the delicacy and discretion General Lafayette had shown, not only in this, but every other circumstance relative to the presidential contest. Now, keep in mind also that he virulently opposed being called Marquis, because he was a citizen, he had renounced his royal title. So, in general, if you're not going to call him Gilbert, you're going to call him General Lafayette. So it's clear that Lafayette's tour served to remind Americans of the sacrifices of the war, but also to highlight the enormous physical progress which had been achieved following the recent gains from the American system. And you can tell this from some of the toasts. These are a couple toasts from at these celebrations of Lafayette in town after town. They would often have a dinner, and you had to have 13 toasts because you had 13 colonies at the time of the Revolution. But usually there were a multiple additions to the toasts. But here are two that were done at the Frederick celebration. Number 10, and this is Frederick, Maryland. It's hard to see this, but this is so dark. This is the long celebration. And every place you would go, they would put up these arches, you know, so you would go down the main street with arches with roses and, you know, little girls, you know, singing songs and all that. So what number 10 toasts internal improvements. The nurture cultivation of our own resources will alone ensure our independence of foreign policy and influence. Number 11, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, the first great capsule of the waters, will be the healing of all sectional complaints in the body politic. So you can see how they're looking at the economic development as a unifying political force. So, and the same spirit is shown by Clay when he gives a speech to Lafayette, and you know, when Lafayette appears before the Congress. He says, the vain wish has sometimes indulged that Providence would allow the patriot, after death, to return to his country and to contemplate the intermediate changes which had taken place, to view the forest felled, the cities built, the mountains leveled, the canals cut, the highways constructed, the progress of the arts, the advancement of learning, and the increase of population. General, your present visit is the realization of the controlling object of that wish. You are in the midst of posterity. So, when 9 months later, Lafayette disembarked from our shores, he had, in fact, that vision of progress had a champion in the White House, and 4 years of hard-fought progress had begun. The general had both observed and contributed to building an even more prosperous United States. Thank you.
Before we begin the question and answer period, it's our custom to pass the hat. Since we don't charge admission to these lectures, we don't sell tickets. We pass the basket. Some of our usual collection people are not here. Can you grab a couple of baskets there, Rich? Yeah. Okay, and while that's going on, any questions?
Questions and book sales will follow.
Question?
Yes, sir.
So he's on tour, he visits Frederick, and he go across the river here, the Leesburg.
No, he went back to.
Repeat the question.
Oh, right. He asked after Lafayette visited Frederick, did he come down to Leesburg? No.
Yeah.
What? No, his trip, he came up to Frederick at the end of 1824, like New Year's Eve, right? It was almost New Year's Eve. And then he went back to Washington. He stayed in Washington. He didn't come to Leesburg until August, almost right before he was to leave. But what he does, and he leaves, when it's possible to move in the weather in 1825, is he tours all the western states. He tours all 24 states at the time. So he goes down to New Orleans. They've had a big celebration there. He goes up to Mississippi. He goes, and then he comes up the Ohio. Actually, there is his ship is wrecked and his dog dies. They actually did a reenactment of the shipwreck. you know, that no dogs were killed, and however. The American Friends of Lafayette have been reenacting all these, the tour in every state where they could find people to host things. So that's, so what he did is he did the whole Western tour. He ended up in Bunker Hill to place a monument in Bunker Hill in, what is the date?
June 17th.
June 17th. So that's, you know, a month or so from now. And then he comes back south and ends up going to Leesburg in August.
I may not have heard it right, but in one of those toasts to the cutting of the C&O Canal in 1825, it's my understanding that Quincy Adams didn't think the first state to pull it until 1828.
Right, but it was well underway in terms of the surveying, and everyone was aware of it. After all, they'd been fighting for this. You know, Charles Fenton Mercer had been fighting for this and agitating for it and building up popular support from at least 1823. And of course, the project as a project was around since Washington's day. So yeah, you heard it correct. You know, he didn't dig the hole until 1828, but everybody knew it was coming. And they wanted it to go up to Frederick, I believe. So that's one reason that they wanted to toast it, say that bring us in on the deal, you know, so we can also ship our stuff that way. Yes, ma'am.
Who accompanied Lafayette on his tour? Did his family cover them, or any other of his?
His son came with him. He had a son named George Washington Lafayette, but his wife and two daughters. Was his wife still alive then? No, she died. She had died. But he had two. Yeah, and he didn't intend to be gone that long. He intended to visit the original 13 states. But people kept asking him to come, you know, and how could he say no? How could he say no?
I think Leesburg was even added on late. They kept asking him, they kept saying.
I mean, little towns would ask, and, you know, the word would get out that he was coming, and people would be on the roadway, and, you know, he would have to limit some of his visits to hi, bye, you know. That's his wife had died partly as a result of, she chose to, that picture I showed you of the prison, after he was in that Olmutz prison for 5 years, and after 2 years or 3, 2 or 3, his wife took her 2 daughters and joined him in prison because she just wanted to see him and share and that she became very ill as a result of that, and died early.
Wasn't there a real great opera that they spoken about Lafayette?
What did she say? What did she ask?
Yeah, my friend here is referencing Fidelio. The Fidelio opera is loosely based on the story of Adrienne Lafayette going to free her political prisoner husband. If you think about it, you know, the circumstances match, right? You know, here someone was put in prison to die, and the wife goes to save him. And she didn't do precisely what Beethoven imagines, and certainly the Emperor of Austria didn't respond the way that the guy did in the opera. But yes, it was an inspirational story at the time.
And she had been in prison herself before she even went to her husband. That's
Yes,
how,
she
that's
was-
how the Monroes helped her. They helped to get her.
Yeah, they helped to keep her from being
Her mother
Beatrice.
and grandmother, I think it is, were both beaten,
Yes, and her
and so
sister.
she could.
Much of her family was executed during the French Revolution.
Yes.
She was also in prison.
Right.
And France wanted Germany to hand over Lafayette, which they considered, except for, the American politicians. They're going to be free men.
Yeah, it was, they were not too happy, and Napoleon wasn't too happy with him either, but he ultimately succumbed to pressure to do it. I have not looked into all the details of that. I'm sure that there are a lot as to why he actually made that decision. So, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this trip.